Hi, folks. This is Abel James, and thanks so much for listening to the Fat Burning Man Show, where we talk about real food and real results. Back once again with us is Dr. Sara Gottfried, and she's the author of The Hormone Cure. Last time she was on the show, we got a lot of really positive feedback from you folks out there about how hormones affect the bodies and the lives of women. So we decided to have her back on after that great feedback to talk about how hormones affect men. So we talk about low T, orgasm, effective exercise, why cholesterol is good for you, and tons more. Before we get to that, I wanted to make one last announcement about my course for Creative Live, which is a 2-day course. It's streaming live on the internet, and I'm going to be talking about fat burning, biohacking. I have special guests, George Bryant, who many of you already know, as well as Dave Asprey, the Bulletproof exec. I'll also be presenting on his course later in that week. So if you'd like to enroll, it's totally free to watch while it's live. After that, you have to pay for it. But during August 26th and 27th, you can watch it for free anywhere in the world. Totally cool. Just head on over to fatburningman.com/creative live, and you can enroll right from there. All right, so on to the show with Dr. Sara Gottfried. We talk about how to raise testosterone. I'll give you a hint. It has something to do with orgasms. We talk about biohacking as well as why cholesterol is good for you. All right, let's go hang out with Dr. Sara. All right, folks, after an absolute outcry from you listeners to get her back on the show, Dr. Sara Gottfried joins us once again. She's the author of The Hormone Cure and a general badass for sure. After a killer show last time where we talked about female hormones and how to go from frazzled, frumpy, fat, and the other F, she's back to take on talking about male hormones this time, as well as her next book. Welcome back.
Thank you, Abel. So happy to be with you.
Awesome. I'm serious. Like, we always get feedback about pretty much every show that we put out there, but people were screaming about this one in a really positive way. And for those of you who haven't listened to that one, I highly encourage you to do so. It's very relevant for women as well as men to understand women, which is one of men's biggest struggles in life. But today, we don't do this very often, specifically focus on male hormones and the issues that we encounter as we try to optimize our lives. So why don't we start with the three amigos, as you call them, the most important things that we should be worrying about right now.
Yeah, well, I talk about the hormonal Charlie's Angels in women, your cortisol, your estrogen, your thyroid, how that's the 80-20 rule. Like, you really want to pay attention to that in women. Mm-hmm. And that's where your focus should be. That's where you're really going to get, minimal effort and yield the best results. And for men, it's the hormonal three amigos: cortisol, testosterone, thyroid. And I love that you kind of frame this as, okay, we're for the guys today, but similar situation where women need to understand this about their men. Yeah. It's another way to make your life easier and better and richer.
So that's why he's acting like a complete dolt today.
Exactly. So I have to tell you, Abel, I want to stay on course here, but My daughter just showed me a picture of Ryan Reynolds, and I realized that you were separated at birth, apparently. I mean, you guys look very similar. I think you're actually more handsome, but I just wanted to throw that in there because it raises my oxytocin to kind of look at focus on you.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you could raise your own oxytocin that way. That's hilarious, Ryan Reynolds. I get that one sometimes. Usually it's Nick Lachey.
Oh, okay. I'll have to look him up.
It's probably the doofy hairdo and the fact that I'm a singer, but not in a boy band. Fortunately, not yet. Anyway, maybe that's something to aspire to. But so let's hammer into those hormones a little bit. I think a lot of people are familiar with testosterone, but why don't you start with that one?
Yeah, testosterone is so important. A lot of people think of it as muscles and sex, but it's so much more than that. So yes, it is one of those hormones that tracks predominantly with your muscle mass, your lean body mass. It does go down as you age. Estrogen goes up, and so your ratio changes, usually sometime in your 30s. So we're going to teach people how to prevent that ratio from changing as you get older today. And I think it's so important to realize that it's not just sex and muscles. It's also that sense of vitality. Mm-hmm. It's involved in your agency, like being able to assert your power in the world. And it's a really important hormone for ambition. really being able to rock your mission. I have guys who come to see me who are in their late 30s, 40s, and 50s, and they say to me, I can't swing for the fence the way that I used to. I can't do it in my work. I can't do it in my workouts. And so that's what we're talking about today.
So how do you prevent that decline then? I've heard a lot of people say the same thing. They're just like, I've been doing the same thing for 20 years and it's always worked. And now I'm getting fat and bored and lazy and this is not like me. And it sounds like that kind of lines up with testosterone.
That's right. I sometimes joke a bit about what it looks like when testosterone starts to go down and estrogen starts to go up. It's the grumpy old man syndrome. Like you feel older before your time. And there's another good joke that I heard, which is low T is when you wake up in the morning and the only thing that's stiff is your back. So I laugh with, great compassion for what is happening for guys who have low testosterone. But some of the symptoms, just to make it super explicit, include, not having morning erections, maybe having some difficulty with your erections in general, not having the sex drive that you used to have. I mean, men definitely reach a peak in that glorified time that we all know between like 18 and 30, and then it starts to go down. But you can track this. So if you look at your testosterone to estradiol ratio, estradiol is the key estrogen that you want to be tracking. We know that that ratio goes down with age. And you want, ideally, for that ratio to be 4 to 8. So 8 is optimal, and definitely less than 4 is not a good thing.
Yeah.
Some of the other symptoms you can see, you can have more love handles, more fat deposits, kind of in an estrogenic pattern. So that includes the hips, a little more fat kind of down here, love handles. And you can also have increased risk of heart disease, more diabetes. So there's these really serious illnesses that track with a lower testosterone to estradiol ratio. So we want to track this. I say, track it like you are going to track your retirement accounts. You want this on your dashboard. You really want to be managing this. I want to talk about a number of ratios today. And cool. I would say the T to E ratio is really a crucial one for the guys.
And so it's really interesting. You can tell that this is becoming more and more of a problem because you're seeing more commercials about it.
Oh, yes.
I was watching
solutions.
I think I was watching the NBA finals, and I don't remember seeing any commercials like this as a kid about low T and how it's almost like this sexy thing to have now because you get to drive a muscle car and like hang out with beautiful women if you have low T, as long as you're taking this drug. So how prevalent is this? It's not just old men, right? It's kind of across the board.
It's across the board. When I learned about low T in medical school 20 plus years ago, it was really isolated among guys who were 40 to 70, but I'm definitely seeing it in younger guys. In fact, I had a couple guys over for dinner last night, and one of them's 37, and he's got a low T situation. He's got high estrogen levels, and he's on an estrogen blocker.
Wow.
And, he was showing me on his iPhone all of these ads for just what you're talking about, different supplements that you can take for testosterone. When I went through medical school, the solution was to start a guy on testosterone. But I want to explain to you why I don't think that's such a great thing.
Okay.
I'm a fan of balancing your hormones, whether you're male or female, with how you eat, move, think, and supplement. I think that is a much more effective strategy than to start frosting yourself with the latest testosterone cream, because it's suppressive. It actually suppresses you from making your own endogenous testosterone. We don't want that. We want to amplify the innate intelligence of the body.
And so for a quick example of that, you just have to look at bodybuilders who don't really have testicles anymore. That's a reason why that's a bad thing.
Yeah, you don't want to go there.
Yeah.
Right? So, this is an issue. I would say the next 10 years of hormones is going to be about hormone resistance. And how often you need higher and higher doses of testosterone to get the same results. And I have to tell you, I had one patient who came to see me. He was a 42-year-old guy, and he had some of these symptoms that we're talking about: low T, not as much ambition, wasn't seeing the response to exercise that he usually saw. he felt like his muscles were becoming more doughy, and he did not like that.
Yeah.
They didn't look like yours, okay, Abel? and so I prescribed a small amount of testosterone for him. This was a few years ago. And he was supposed to use 1/4 to 1/2 gram a day, which is a very small amount. Like, it's a teeny little dollop.
Yeah.
And he came to see me, and his testosterone like went up 10x. And I was just like, okay, what's going on? Why is your testosterone so high? And he's like, I really liked how I felt, and I didn't feel as good after I was on it for a couple of weeks. So I just, I went up on the dose. And I'm like, how much? He's like, just like this much.
Jeez. Using it as like, cream cheese.
Pretty much. I mean, he was using, like a 1/2 cup a day. And
jeez,
we don't want that. So you can get into these situations with testosterone that you don't want to get into. And so let's talk about some of the solutions. Should we do that?
Let's do it.
Yeah. All right. So you got to stay away from sugar. I mean, this is like the mantra that I think, do you have anyone on your show who doesn't say stay away from sugar?
I guess I haven't had the carb backloading guy yet, but I'm pretty sure he'd be the only exception.
He would be the only one. Yeah. So you got to stay away from sugar. It robs you of testosterone. We also know that vitamin D appears to raise your body's ability to make testosterone. The data is a little bit mixed, but for the most part, I think that's a good idea. It definitely revs up metabolism. We want that. So vitamin D. L-carnitine has been shown to raise testosterone. So that's another supplement that I'm a fan of. We know that orgasm raises testosterone. Abel, anytime I talk to you, orgasm's going to be part of the conversation. I think we should just get it out of the way right now. And
I don't think that one's a hard sell either. It's
not a hard sell. Yeah. So those are some examples of ways that you can raise testosterone. I could go on and on, but I think the main takeaway is track your T to E ratio, testosterone to estrogen, and then do some of these natural solutions that raise testosterone. I can tell you some of them, like tribulus, not as proven.
Yeah.
They're proven in rats. The evidence is not great when it comes to raising testosterone in men. So I'm really cautious about, rather than just making your pee more expensive, it may be that we just don't have the data yet. I'd rather go with the things that are really proven to make a difference.
And so quickly, once again, what are the things that are proven as opposed to not really?
So staying away from sugar. We'll recap here. Vitamin D, the data's mixed, but I still am in favor of it. L-carnitine and orgasm.
Yeah.
Those are my favorites.
Nice. I think that's the wrong order. All right. So what about the other two amigos?
The other two amigos. So cortisol is such an important one. I think, one of the key ways that you fall down a hormonal flight of stairs, starting usually in your 30s, is that you're not minding your cortisol. And you and I have talked about this before. I think it's such an important lever when it comes to managing your hormones, whether you're male or female. I mean, the cool part here, Abel, is that guys do better with stress than women do. I mean, it pains me to say it. I think we all know this intuitively, but stress favors men. Okay,
so why and how? Because I'm curious about this one. This is really interesting.
It is really interesting. Women, I think part of it is the way that women are in the workplace. I think there's kind of a way that we can be more masculine in the workplace, and it doesn't really suit us. So this is maybe a conversation for another time, but I know that based on the science that women are much more likely to have a problem with the stress response.
Yeah.
And that's called the HPA, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So I'm not saying that men are immune from bad stress. It's just that women are much more vulnerable.
Okay.
And that's probably why women have double the rate of insomnia as men do. Wow. Double the rates of depression, double the rates of anxiety. It has to do with our stress response. So that being said, I still think that you want to manage cortisol as a guy.
Yeah.
And here's another ratio for your dashboard. I want you to track your cortisol to DHEA ratio. Cortisol to DHEA. This is a really interesting ratio. And I like ratios because, first of all, I'm an MIT bioengineer, so I'm like a total geek. And I love to have more than one number. I like to, sort of track ratios over time. And secondly, we know that things like depression, low T, those things are linked to a higher cortisol to DHEA ratio. Because when you're stressed, here's what happens. When you're chronically stressed and you don't have relief or you don't have a good way to manage it, cortisol goes up, DHEA goes down. DHEA is the father of testosterone. It's the hormone that gets converted into testosterone. So you got to track this over time. And some of the ways that you can deal with cortisol as a guy and to keep it from rising too high, you want it in the Goldilocks position of not too high, not too low.
Yeah.
Some of the ways that you can manage it include omega-3s. Get religious about omega-3s. They are such an important small hinge that swings a big door. So a lot of people have omega-3s in their fridge and they're just not taking them regularly. And so I want to change that. It also has been shown to increase lean body mass in guys, probably related to the cortisol to DHEA ratio. So there's another bonus prize that you get. Phosphatidylserine is another favorite one. It's an extract from plant membranes, cell membranes, and it's been shown to lower cortisol as omega-3s have been. And it also helps with mood. So if you are feeling that grumpy old man syndrome, phosphatidylserine is your new best friend. I think it's really helpful. And then hit the pause button. I love that you're a musician, Abel, because we know that music really helps you modulate your cortisol levels.
Right.
And you probably know this as someone experienced in this area. But we all have to find, kind of our top ways of managing cortisol so that it's not managing you and robbing you of testosterone, robbing you of DHEA.
Yeah, that's a really good point because I think so many men especially are almost like too driven, right? They feel like if they're not moving forward all the time, they're moving backward. And so it's really important. I kind of got this one by accident. I became a musician because there was nothing else to do. Like we didn't have cable or like culture where I grew up. We just had a bunch of instruments lying around. So I learned how to play, and that was my outlet. That was the thing that when I was younger and then a teenager and then growing up was always there and available to me when I knew that there was like no other way to really get that release and relax and take a few minutes to write or just play or have fun. And so it's certainly not music for everyone, although that one is really useful and really cool and my personal favorite. But like I have a really good friend of mine, his is volleyball. He goes out to the volleyball court a few times a week and just has an absolute blast. And I think a lot of guys right now are kind of struggling to find their thing, right? Their cool hobby. They might have their work, they might do CrossFit or some sport or something like that, but it's almost like this obsession that could actually wind up reducing their testosterone. So an example of that would be like super high intensity CrossFit. I know a lot of guys come out of there and that they have their testosterone tested and it's just in the dumps. It's nowhere to be found. Same is true often with endurance exercise. Can you talk about that a little bit? How testosterone and cortisol are related to overperformance in some way?
Oh, absolutely. And I see this a lot, especially in ex-athletes. And I'm pausing even to call them ex-athletes because I think once you're an athlete, you're always an athlete. You sort of have that identity. I'm married to one of these guys, right? He played tackle football for 12 years and he still thinks that he can go play, 36 rounds of golf, holes of golf, without any sort of training or preparation. Anyway, so there's a couple of things going on. What you just reminded me of is an interesting study. It's got a funny name. It's the Helsinki Businessman Study. And they looked at men and they tracked different types of exercise that they were doing. They divided men into 3 different groups. Those who were more sedentary, those who had a moderate amount of exercise, like the volleyball players, and then those who were like hardcore athletes, mostly ultra marathoners, marathon runners, et cetera, endurance athletes. And they tracked their telomeres. So as probably our listeners know, telomeres are those cute little caps on your chromosomes that can shorten prematurely, and they're one of the best indicators of your biological age as opposed to your chronological age. Mm-hmm. And you want to pay attention to this. It's another thing for your dashboard that I want you to notice. And they found, quite interestingly, that it was the moderate exercisers among the Helsinki businessmen who had the best telomere length, who were aging the slowest.
Yeah.
So the sedentary actually looked as bad as the endurance athletes.
Interesting.
So that's really interesting data. And they basically, the problem here is that when you're an endurance athlete, especially if you're a runner, ultra marathoner is kind of my classic example. When you hit your VO2 max really hard, when you're breathing, that really hard way that we do when we're running, that raises your cortisol. It increases the stress in your body. And I think one way to think about it is if you think of the Dalai Lama or you think of a Tibetan monk and you compare the monk to an ultra marathoner, mm-hmm. like who's aging faster? We know that it's the endurance athlete. We know it's the ultra marathoner. There's a lot of stress on the body. They tend to not recover from injury very well. And cortisol tends to be quite a bit higher in those folks and testosterone lower. So that's one of the things that we see. What happens in your body, your body has this intelligence and sometimes it backfires. Mm-hmm. If you're someone who makes a lot of cortisol, if you're kind of a stress junkie like I used to be, you're going to make cortisol at the expense of your other hormones.
Yeah.
So there's this thing called pregnenolone steal, where you just make cortisol, cortisol, cortisol kind of monomaniacally, and you don't make as much as the other part of the biochemical tree mm-hmm. in your body. So you don't make as much testosterone, you don't make as much DHEA. It's all getting robbed to make the cortisol. So that's how you end up with low T and high cortisol in that situation.
So what can you do to, reduce the amount of cortisol that you create and kind of trend in the positive direction?
Well, one of the things I really like in terms of exercise, and I think you and I talked about this last time, is burst training. I think burst training is a good way to recover, to have kind of a sprint recovery cycle with your exercise. And I think that actually is a really good metaphor for the rest of your life. Yeah. We all need to sprint recover. We know it's true for concert violinists. There's mm-hmm. a really great study that Malcolm Gladwell talked about in Outliers, where we know that concert violinists focus on kind of this hardcore practice, and then they have a really clear recovery. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really valuable when it comes to exercise. And then some of these other strategies, like how do you hit the pause button, phosphatidylserine, omega-3s. Another favorite supplement is L-theanine. Mm-hmm. L-theanine. And that really helps with the focus that sometimes can fade as you get older.
Yeah, I wouldn't know about that. Not yet, anyway. But we'll see. I'm sure I'll know soon enough. All right, so the last amigo.
The last amigo. So thyroid. Thyroid problems are about 15 times more common in women than men, but they still affect men. In fact, I happen to know that you've recovered from some thyroid issues. Is that right, Abel?
That's right. It runs in the family. My mom is on what is affectionately known as piggy thyroid at the moment. She finds it works pretty well for her, but when she was hypothyroid, or when she exhibited the symptoms of it, it was really like she was a different person. And she's pretty much the first one to admit that. And so, yeah, me personally, growing up, and I think it started in my teens, we couldn't get my body temperature above 96 degrees. And then I started exhibiting a bunch of other symptoms, but fortunately was able to turn it around. And to be perfectly honest, since I changed so many things around the same time, it's hard to know exactly what it was, but I know that it's working now, which is excellent. But it's always something to keep on the radar. But let's talk about why it's important and what exactly it is. Why should a dude worry about his thyroid?
Yeah, well, you want to think thyroid if you have some of the classic symptoms. And the symptoms can vary a bit in men versus women. What are they? Hair loss. Mm-hmm. Don't take it sitting down. Check out your thyroid. Mm-hmm. Don't just assume that this is something that runs in your family. Also, depression. So we know that 20% of people with depression have a slow thyroid. 50% of people with depression have high cortisol.
Wow.
So you want to think hormones rather than just assuming you've got some sort of moral failing. And, another thing that we know in guys that I think is important is that depression doesn't show up the same way in guys. Mm-hmm. In fact, depression is often underdiagnosed in guys compared to women. Some of that is women talk about their feelings more, kind of the stereotype of a woman talking about her mood and talking about those sort of things more than a guy would. But we know that guys with depression have more physical symptoms. They have more low back pain. They have, aches and pains, joint issues, and that can actually be a sign of depression. So you want to think about that. We also see with people with a slow thyroid, low body temperature, as you just described, feeling cold, having like iceberg feet when you go to bed. Another one that's important is weight gain. So if you notice that your weight's climbing up, that's a sign that it could be your thyroid. Finally, just low energy, fatigue. There can be some overlap with some of these other things we've talked about because high cortisol can make you tired. It can give you kind of this weird tired but wired paradoxical feeling. And also low T can make you feel tired. So all of these can conspire against you. But you want to think about those three amigos. Is there something going on with your thyroid? And then when it comes to tracking it, this is one of those hormones that I think conventional doctors don't track very well.
Yeah.
And they tend to use the old school numbers when it comes to your thyroid blood tests. And I'm a big fan of going for the optimal range, not like the old school, here's 95% of the population and what's normal for them because, oh, by the way, something like 20 to 30% of the normal population has a slow thyroid. So I don't want to be in that group of the 95%. I want to be in the optimal zone. And so we know that that's a TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, between about 0.3 and 1.5. Mm-hmm. So that's a pretty tight range that I recommend. But that's what really helps you rock your mission. Yeah. And I think that's important for guys. Another ratio, since we're on kind of this ratio thread, is to track something called your free T3 to reverse T3 ratio. So this is another good one for your dashboard. And that basically you want to have greater than 20. I find that that's a really valuable thing to be tracking. And one little point for guys, there's a lot of guys who go low carb or they go paleo. And for some of us, that can raise your reverse T3. Reverse T3 is this interesting hormone. You might be familiar with it too, Abel. It blocks your thyroid receptors. Yeah. So you can have a normal TSH and you may still feel hypothyroid because of reverse T3. So I'm a fan of tracking that, especially if your numbers, your laboratory values don't reflect how you feel.
Right. And that's something that I learned from my mother because the numbers that she had predicted that she would be feeling in a completely different way than she actually was. So when it comes to actually fine-tuning the way that you feel and the way that your body operates, it's not always about that number. It's about, definitely keeping that number in mind, but really judging based upon how you look, feel, and perform. And I can definitely attest to what you're talking about. When I went low carb for a certain period of time, lower than I normally am, which I don't avoid carbs. I just don't usually prioritize them to eat, and I stay away from sugar. So normally that keeps it fairly low. But I was trying to avoid carbs for a period of like 2 weeks or something like that. Then all of a sudden, I started feeling super sluggish and bored and a little bit cranky and depressed. I'm like, what the heck is going on here? And I didn't know exactly what it was at the time, but I tried eating a sweet potato and I felt like $1 million. It was amazing. And so now I make sure that I eat, at least like 1 or 2 a week, generally speaking. And I haven't felt that again since. But I did definitely notice that for me personally, my own body, and it could have been the thyroid, it didn't work that well for me doing an extended, very low carb session. And I know I wasn't performing nearly as well too. So there are a lot of different ways of thinking about it and ways to measure it. But before we move on too far, let's talk about measurement a little bit, because I know you're a biohacker and obviously you're a doctor. There are all sorts of different ways that you can measure it. What would you recommend to say, the person who's listening to this show about how they can make sure that they're measuring these ratios and these different levels of the hormones and other things in their bodies?
Well, I think the ideal way to measure these is to have a collaborative doctor that you're working with. It doesn't have to be an MD. It could be an osteopathic physician. It could be a naturopathic physician. It could be any practitioner who's trained to manage these ratios in an optimal way. So I am a big fan of having someone collaborative. I talk about that quite a bit in my book, and I even give scripts for how to get people on board with you to order these tests. So that's the ideal. And I like to measure it in blood because blood testing is really the universal language in conventional medicine. And I want to bring conventional medicine, into the modern century. Yeah. So that they're paying attention to these things and not ignoring cortisol and testosterone and reverse T3.
Yeah.
So I'm a fan of blood testing. Now, I can tell you there's a lot of clinicians out there who just look at you blankly when you want to order these things and don't think it's worth. Yeah, everyone I think has encountered this. And in that situation, it may be time to look for a new practitioner because I think it's great if you can get your insurance to pay for it. But another thing you can do is you can work with a lab that is directly involved with consumers. And there's a lot of them. I have a list of them in the appendix of my book. Places like mymedlab.com, Canary Club is another example. Some of these offer home testing where you can prick your finger and you can measure your thyroid and testosterone and sex hormone binding globulin, some of these other tests that I think are valuable when it comes to your own dashboard and tracking your 3 amigos.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, and the idea that it's coming into your home and you don't even have to get off your butt anymore to measure this stuff is pretty dang cool.
Yeah, it's coming. I mean, we expect by 2015 that you're going to be able to test your entire set of DNA for about $100. That's coming. And I can tell you, conventional medicine has no idea how to make that actionable.
Yeah.
So it's that situation where it's not do it yourself as a consumer, but I think the more empowered you are, the more knowledge you have to really step forward into the grace of amplifying the intelligence of your body, the better.
Yeah. Now, what about some of the things that men are doing wrong? Because I see a lot of that also. So cholesterol is a big issue, or blood pressure and other drugs that you can take around those. So what do you generally recommend?
What do I generally recommend in terms of looking at the things that are being done wrong?
Yeah, so I'm fishing a little bit here.
Oh yeah.
I'm not a doctor, but statins, for example.
Oh,
the pros and cons.
Oh my gosh. So, statins are sort of considered this cure-all for pretty much any problem that you have. And I don't think cholesterol is the enemy. I think the enemy is inflammation in your body and sugar. I would say if I had to choose one bad player when it comes to creating a bad neighborhood in your body, a bad neighborhood for your DNA and for your hormones, it's sugar. I mean, and I'm talking also about fructose. Like fructose is processed by the liver. It's not necessarily a good thing. If you talk to cancer researchers, for instance, and ask them what they eat vegetables, plus some protein.
Yeah.
And so that's, the food plan that I think is really important to start with. And I really think that most of health actually comes down to your food. Supplements move the needle a little bit, and definitely exercise, movement, the ways that you calm down and kind of retrain your mind, those are all important.
Yeah.
But when it comes to cholesterol, you need a certain amount of cholesterol because it makes all these hormones that we're talking about, right? It doesn't make thyroid, but cholesterol in your body gets converted into pregnenolone, and that's the mother hormone of these hormones we've been talking about, cortisol, DHEA, testosterone. And so you need a certain amount of cholesterol to really function well. And I can tell you, when I was a vegan, when I went to my first anatomy class at Harvard Medical School, I was so disgusted as we dissected this poor cadaver that I became vegan. And my cholesterol dropped to like 120. And I was never so tired in my life. Like I could barely make any sex hormones at all. My boobs like disappeared. It was not pretty.
Wow.
And And that happens, for people who don't have adequate cholesterol. So I'm not a big fan of taking your cholesterol and dropping it to the floor. Mm-hmm. We got to use some of these much more modern, intelligent strategies for how to deal with your cholesterol. And, a lot of people are still getting their cholesterol tested in the old school way. Mm-hmm. I'm a fan of something called the VAP, or extended cholesterol panel, where you look not just at your bad cholesterol, your LDL, but you fractionate it into some different categories, mm-hmm. the large fluffies versus the the small dense ones. See, I have a thyroid issue, so I get a little hoarse.
Yeah. So now there's another issue too. A lot of guys don't tend to like to go to the doctor.
Oh, yes.
What do you do about that one?
Well, this is where I think, I think a collaborative clinician is really important, but yeah, let's be realistic. This is where some do-it-yourself testing, I think, can be valuable. Mm-hmm. And to build out your dashboard, I think the guys that I work with are much more amenable to, okay, teach me what goes on the dashboard. Like, what are the metrics that I need to track over time that really matter for me?
Yeah.
And so some of those metrics that we talked about, like your T to E ratio, your cortisol to DHEA ratio, your free T3 to reverse T3 ratio, those are really key. Mm-hmm. And you can test them on your own. I would say even for guys who don't have any of these symptoms that we're talking about, if you do some baseline testing in your 20s and 30s, I think that's hugely valuable.
Yeah.
So the good news for the guys who don't like to go see a doctor is that you can do a lot of this on your own. Mm-hmm. And then, make a decision if your numbers are off, for instance, to go see a clinician.
Yeah. And I'm sure you have an opinion on this. How do you find not just a doctor, but like a great doctor, someone who you trust, someone who's giving you the right information? Because God knows there's a lot of not that going on. But how do you find someone like you, for example, if you're scattered about the country or even the world?
Well, my first answer is that I've trained a small army of people to practice in this way, because I've got like a 5-year waiting list and can't add one more person to the list.
Yeah.
And so if you want to see those folks, can I just mention a URL for people
absolutely.
To go to?
Yeah.
So this URL is thehormonecurebook.com/practitioners. Thehormonecurebook.com/practitioners. You can go to that page and you can find out if there's someone in your area. These are folks that are all over the world who've been trained in my method. My method is really a hybrid of functional medicine, kind of the Mark Hyman style of fill in nutritional gaps, look upstream and downstream and not just mass symptoms, and integrative medicine, kind of the Andy Weil Beard, use nutrition. So the way that I work is a little bit different than a lot of other folks, but you could also go to those two websites. You can go to functionalmedicine.org and look for a functional medicine doctor. Mm-hmm. You can also go to Andy Weil's website at the University of Arizona, where he's trained integrative medicine fellows. So you can go to those places too.
Cool. So there is hope.
There's hope.
We're fighting the good fight. All right. I can't believe it, but we're almost out of time. Why don't you tell folks, I know you're working on some cool stuff, what you're working on now, and remind them where they can find you.
Sure. Well, the best way to find me is to go to saragottfriedmd.com. That's kind of the mothership. And my book website is thehormonecurebook.com. What am I working on next? Well, I just sold my next 2 books, and yay! So my next project is, I can't mention the title, but it's basically how to reset your hormones and metabolism, including those hormones that we've been talking about today.
Cool.
In 72 hours. So it's a really cool protocol. I can't wait to share it with your listeners.
Awesome. That's 72 hours, huh?
72 hours. You got to freshen up the molecular sex. I think we talked about this before. The molecular sex that's happening between your hormones and the receptor. You got to upgrade the sex.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on again. Maybe we'll have to make this a regular thing, because it's fascinating. I think it's really useful for hopefully this is really useful for men who are listening, but also for women as well, who kind of want to understand the men in their lives a little bit better and maybe help them along, because Lord knows we can drag our feet sometimes. So thanks so much for coming on. We'll have to have you on again soon.
My pleasure, Abel. I'd love to be on with you again.
Awesome. Cheers.
Cheers.